Hi everyone, and welcome to this new session of the lab, the Laboratoire of Lyrique. For this last session of the season, I'm happy to welcome once again Antonio Casilli, sociologist, professor at Telecom Paris, and researcher at the CNRS Interdisciplinary Institute of Innovation for the seminar studying digital cultures, which he has been leading for quite many years now at EHESS. For those of you who may not know Antonio yet, he's, among many other things, the author of several inquiries into digital labor and the condition of platform gig workers and click workers. So this is the fourth session of the Ethics and Artificial Intelligence series of conversations we started in January this year. So if you haven't been with us before, you can find the videos of the previous sessions on the Lyrique website. Tonight, I have the pleasure to leave you with Antonio and our incredible guests, the researcher Lilly Irani and the artist Elisa Giardina Papa. Antonio, you can take it from here.
Thank you very much, Aude. I hope that you can see me, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you for the last session of this academic year of this series of talks. We've been meeting some remarkable researchers and artists that all throughout these few months have been helping us understand topics related to ethics and AI. Today we will open the focus and help you with a little help from Lilly Irani and from Elisa Giardina Papa, understand some other aspects of the possible strategies that can be put in place to establish what can be defined as ethics from below. So the first guest of today's seminar is Lilly Irani. I am particularly happy to have her here. Officially, Lilly was supposed to be our visiting professor for this year at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Then eventually the pandemic kicked in and everything went all right. But anyway, we are very happy that at least remotely we have the pleasure of listening to her and of course talking to her. Lilly Irani is an associate professor at UCSD, the University of California, San Diego. She is the author, among other things, of two books. The first one is called Chasing Innovation, Making Entrepreneurial Citizenship in Modern India, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2019. And another book co-authored with Jesse Marx, published by Toller, California in 2021, is called Redacted. She is, among other things, the co-founder of the digital worker advocacy group / workers group called Turcopticon. And today we will discuss and with her see what are the links between this first part of her career that made her one of the pioneers of the study of what can be described as micro work, or the work that is necessary to produce artificial intelligence. And then her more recent research have been focusing on smart cities. Well, you will see that smart is sometimes an euphemism for other things. So, Lilly, the floor is yours, and this first segment of today's seminar will last until approximately 8 p.m. Paris time, and then we will have another time for another segment for Elisa Giardina Papa, and then we will have our Q&A with the students and the public and the people in attendance. Lilly, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting me and hosting this important discussion with Elisa and Aude and others. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Today, the topic of my talk is I'm posing a much bigger question than any one person, including me, can answer. But the question is, how do we claim democracy for digital infrastructures? While this topic is bigger than what any one person can address, I want to keep this question as a collective guiding frame. And of course, there are many debates and even struggles over what constitutes proper democracy. But here I just pose democracy as a horizon of the collective deliberation and formation of our public lives, sometimes through the process of struggle. And I don't fix on a particular formulation of democracy, because I feel that with the way digital infrastructures are designed and deployed in our lives, we are so far from any of the definitions that I just wanted to ground us in some concrete case studies of what this kind of claim may look like. Also, as I begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge that I'm living and working on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation that spans across and precedes the US-Mexico border. So the borders that have been built are themselves another kind of anti-democratic structure. The backdrop of this talk is the growth of a call for ethics as we see the rise of computational infrastructures pervading aspects of our daily lives, first driven by technology companies looking for more markets, looking for more kind of layers of life to sell their products into. And then also as these technologies are being integrated into more and more state practices, including policing and education. What I want to argue is to deepen our democratic control of digital infrastructures, we have to focus on political agency. And by political agency, I mean the capacity of agents to create effects through direct and institutional action. Design, research, or tool building, interruptive software, media art alone are ill-equipped to transform the infrastructures that are coming to surround us and our relations. My way into this talk is primarily through a case study. I'm going to begin with the problem of political agency and outline what I see as the limits of design, which was primarily how I was trained to encounter and to bring human concerns into the form of our technologies. Then I'll focus on the case study of the Trust Coalition in San Diego, which is a coalition of over 30 community organizations that have been struggling over the last 2 years to subject surveillance technologies in San Diego and coming into San Diego to democratic oversight. And then I'll zoom out again to speak about how we might think about claiming political agency over large-scale infrastructures and the way it requires us to learn new ways of organizing and relating. Antonio mentioned the work that I've done with Amazon Mechanical Turk workers as well, that very much 10 years of struggle to improve the conditions of digital labor as a professor and as a software activist is very much the backdrop of this talk, very much the backdrop of why I've come to see limitations in critical design and tactical media practices, or even expert practices like the practices of critical research, but I'm not going to talk about that during the talk. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. For the sake of time, I've relegated that to the Q&A discussion portion. So this problem of political agency over digital infrastructures is the problem of being able to perceive and act on digital infrastructures that are often invisible in the constitution of daily life, but have become pervasive. So from transportation with Uber to Facebook mediating our social relationships, our leisure relationships, to infrastructures that mediate the way we do labor, like the crowdsourcing technologies that Antonio mentioned, to even more invisible technologies that are only known by and used by the police, like automated license plate readers, tracking where our cars go, taking pictures of where our cars go, and generating data about where our cars go and what they look like, that's shared across public agencies, at least in the United States, across 800 public agencies. These infrastructures are invisible to most of us, but we are visible to most of these infrastructures. And the San Diego smart streetlights that is going to be the focus of the talk today is just one of these surveillance infrastructures that makes data out of all of us for the benefit of some particular programs or agendas. These to draw from infrastructure studies, a rich area of scholarship in science and technology studies, I quote Paul Edwards in saying, infrastructure is best defined negatively as those systems without which contemporary societies cannot function. They cut across space and communities. They're invisible to most of us. And they also affect people differentially. So Susan Lee Starr, a sociologist of infrastructures, famously wrote about the ways that infrastructures standardize forms of life, categories of knowledge. And then there are those people who fall between the cracks, who are misrecognized, or all of us, as we pass through a world mediated by these infrastructures, find ourselves torqued and twisted, was the language she used, as institutions treat us in accordance with the way these infrastructures sense us. So there are many challenges to gaining political agency over these infrastructures. First, infrastructures are often a means of doing politics, but politics outside of the realm of politics. Chandra Mukherjee, a sociologist of culture, she's speaking about canals and trains, infrastructures like this, but she talks about the process of logistical power by which engineers and managers shape logistical process. These seem like technocratic processes, but they actually organize the circulation and recognition of people and things. And so infrastructures can not seem political, but they absolutely are political. In the United States, at least, there's many of these digital infrastructures are privately owned. Neoliberal forms of governance in many countries encourage forms of private-public partnership to reduce the costs of public functions in partnership with private companies, who then turn to gaining a profit through operating infrastructures. And this private ownership then gives companies rights, at least in the United States, to be shielded, to shield their technologies from public scrutiny by claiming that their technologies are private property or trade secrets. Also in the United States, lobbying and the regulatory shaping of the laws that guide and govern these infrastructures, the shaping by private companies is a major issue. To give you one example, face recognition technology is an immensely complex technology. It's integrated into law enforcement purposes to find people, find protesters, as many of us have probably heard and spoken about. It's also integrated into Apple iPhones as a way of getting you into your phone. Microsoft is a major provider of face recognition technology, and they have taken to writing face recognition, proposing face recognition laws. They've passed in Washington state in the US, and they tried to pass in California. And these laws provide for a certain kind of transparency and auditing of facial recognition algorithms to make sure they don't demonstrate, say, racial bias when they are tested by auditors. But ultimately, this regulation is about creating a kind of regulation that is very comfortable for a major corporation like Microsoft and its lawyers and its sales teams to comply with, and it would be very difficult for citizens, local communities to use to claim accountability over the way these infrastructures are affecting their locally conditioned lives. Another challenge of gaining political agency over these infrastructures is that those who have the training to dissect and trace these infrastructures, the engineers, for example, are often not the ones that are most directly harmed. So in the United States, as we are organized under a system of racial capitalism, where where education about computing is highly unevenly distributed, access to public education is highly unevenly distributed, and the carceral system has much more negative impacts on racialized, especially Black populations. Those who are maybe being affected by, say, policing surveillance technologies also have the least access to the kinds of education that would give you the technical knowledge to dissect the claims that companies make, or dissect the claims that cities make about what these technologies can and can't do in processes of public accountability. And finally, Susan Lee Starr famously described infrastructure as that which is often, we often work through and is not present to us, becomes phenomenologically almost invisible. And when infrastructures are invisible to many, both because they're deliberately made opaque or because we get used to them as part of the fabric of our daily lives, this poses a challenge for community organizing and direct action, because it's hard, because you have to first make this infrastructure visible to people, then you have to show why they should care about it before you can get people to act together on it, which I'll talk more about. So to come to the theme of this session of ethics from below, what I want to emphasize is that even though there are many challenges to gaining political agency over infrastructure, it is essential that that those of us who are directly affected by these infrastructures, even if we don't always know how, attempt to develop counter practices to challenge the role these infrastructures play in our daily lives. And so I use below to highlight workarounds and counter practices of those who are subordinate or subjected to state power. And those techniques from below are informed and refined by everyday interactions people have with these infrastructural systems and the institutions that they're embedded in, including historically before the incursion of the digital. Those above have the power to deploy and to reconfigure infrastructural technologies, but tactics of subtle resistance in everyday life, of the sort David Certeau would talk about, I feel are not enough. And so I'm calling for us to formulate ways to develop stronger, more broad-based forms of political agency and struggle over these infrastructures. So the challenge becomes how to practice ethics from below in coalitions that are broad enough to challenge dominant and profitable projects of logistical and infrastructural power. How can researchers, artists, and knowledge workers do our work in ways that strengthen the hand of other communities that have a stake in these technologies? So in human-computer interaction and digital studies, there's been a broad range of recent work that points to the power of community-led transformation of technologies and the importance of communities, those who are not experts. I think communities become a shorthand, coming together in struggle. So Digital Dead End begins by Virginia Eubanks, begins from the problem of creating a computer center for people who are very low income, and it offers methods for project-oriented community building to strengthen community agency to direct local technology deployments. Design Justice by Sasha Costanza Chalk calls for community control and political accountability for technologies and calls on us to put technology design in the service of communities and social movements. Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin centers on race and anti-Blackness in the history of the United States and shows what technology practice in service of abolition movements in particular could look like. And finally, talk that was very inspirational to me is Yeshi Milner from Data for Black Lives giving a keynote, Abolish Big Data at UC Irvine in 2019. And in this talk, she talked not just about the role of designers, not just the role of nonprofits, but the role of everyday citizens encountering technologies of surveillance that are being installed in their children's schools, being installed in their hospitals, and getting together in local social movements that often don't make it into the texts of books, may not even make it into the local news, but use the operations of local government as a way of struggling against, as a field of struggle against the incursion of these kind of large company and government imposed technologies. I've learned a tremendous amount from these works, but I want to pick up in this talk with the question of not just how can design serve movements, but how can we account for and build up the very movements that we hope to contribute to. It's not always the case that there is a social movement ready to tackle these technologies. And what resources can we as artists, designers, and knowledge workers offer to strengthen the political agency and collective voice of these movements? So with that, I turn to the case of building up the Trust Coalition, or the Transparent Responsible Use of Surveillance Technology Coalition in San Diego, which sought to redirect San Diego's Smart City project and subject surveillance technologies to democratic oversight processes by changing the city law. So this case is about how a coalition of community groups, including racial justice organizers and tech workers, came together and struggle. This case illustrates a variety of ways that information studies researchers, HCI practitioners, and technologists can put their knowledge practices to work to contribute to building the political agency of an anti-surveillance coalition. So to introduce the smart streetlights problem in San Diego, first I'll start by saying the battle over smart streetlights is a battle between what the city said the smart streetlights were and what it really was. But it's been a lot of work to figure out what it really is. So the smart streetlights were installed by the city in 2016 when the city got permission from the city council. These are city council in US cities are usually elected officials who are responsible for allocating budgets, for setting local municipal laws. When the champions of these streetlights from the mayor's office proposed this system to city council, they said, these smart streetlights are simply a power saving measure that fit into our climate action plan. They know when to turn the lights on and when to turn the lights off based on power sensors that detect lights. The power savings from this program, the mayor's office champion said, will more than make up for the $30 million cost of the streetlights in power savings. And that was the extent of the discussion. Now, what the streetlights, so the city council voted yes on this loan, even progressive members who wanted to bolster meeting the city's climate action plan goals. But what the streetlights really were was cameras, microphones, a hard drive that takes the video and uploads it to a network cloud, artificial intelligence that detects objects in the live streaming video. The objects putatively are the object detection algorithms are putatively to develop data that's supposed to assist in planning, so detecting buses, bicycles, pedestrians, parking spaces. But you could easily imagine that those algorithms would be updated to detect other kinds of entities that might be of interest. You could imagine that license plate readers that track the location of cars which are identified with individuals across the city could easily be installed on this. You could easily imagine that perhaps facial recognition could also be installed on these. It's a longer topic we can get into in the Q&A. But none of this was discussed by the city council. Instead, once it was approved by city council, the mayor's office started promoting the smart streetlights as a platform for innovation, as a platform for turning San Diego into a gentrified tech metropolis that could attract entrepreneurs from places like Seattle and San Francisco to San Diego to build civic tech apps and to be early entrepreneurs on this smart cities platform. So I mentioned that the streetlights have object detection algorithms on it. And the objects that are detected and the live video streams can be made available through application programmer interface or an API. Oh, this is a standardized way that programmers can access computational infrastructure to extract data from it. So the idea for the mayor's office and the economic development officials was that these 4,000 streetlights that were installed all over the city, transforming our daily movements into data, could then make the data available for people who could become entrepreneurs building apps, and in some sense become early adopters. And then as the company that made the streetlights, at the time General Electric, installed these streetlights in other cities across the world, then San Diego's entrepreneurs could have had an early opportunity to be there to access that market. So I actually personally found out about the streetlights fairly early on because I'm part of the design lab at UCSD. I am part of a location in the political economy of California where we are given privileged access to information about these technology infrastructures. However, while I was concerned about the surveillance implications of these cameras, situated as I was as a professor in a university and affiliated with technology workers, I didn't understand enough about other kinds of social movements in San Diego, in my own city, to understand where to take those concerns and how to bring them to people to perhaps build up a movement around it. In short, I didn't know how to be an organizer, and I had been told that my means for shaping technology was primarily supposed to be through arts and design, imagining otherwise, and kind of informing the public discourse. The public discourse here was organized so that only a certain segment of people were to have optimistic, promising visions of how the technology could be used as entrepreneurs, and a whole other segment of the population, most of the population in San Diego, those who might potentially be criminalized through this technology, didn't even know it existed. That started to change in 2019 as the city wanted to expand the streetlights program. Perhaps because some bureaucrat within the city felt that something was wrong and maybe people should have a public discussion before this streetlights program expands, the city started holding public forums in libraries and community centers. The public forums had a very leading title, Technology for Good, San Diego is a Smart City. And very few people came to the initial meetings. So, the kinds of people who might come to a Technology for Good meeting are probably technologists. Why would somebody who doesn't particularly care about technology show up? Why would but one person who did show up was Khalid Alexander, who's the founder of a group called Pillars of the Community in San Diego. And what his group has done historically is fight the way that police surveil Black communities in Southeast San Diego, label community members as gang members in a process that I'll talk more about, and then subject people in the community to criminal justice processes that often then add years to the convictions of people who are labeled as gang members. So Khalid was very familiar with the problems of surveillance in the context of institutions that use a racialized vision to infer criminality on people who have not even necessarily done anything wrong. And so he got a tip, he went to this meeting, he found out there were like 3 city officials there, police officer, someone from the sustainability department, and then someone from GE Current had come to answer questions about technology, and he was the only person there. And he knew enough to be creeped out, so he then reached out to organizers who had organized around racial justice issues in San Diego with different community groups. This included immigration rights groups, refugee rights groups, Muslim organizations, racial justice organizations, and he asked them all to come to the next community meeting. And that's how I got involved, because I'm part of a group called Tech Workers Coalition, and Khalid got in touch with someone in Tech Workers Coalition, and 4 of us went to the meeting to help ask questions. What became clear at the community meeting was that the smart streetlights had primarily become a tool for the police. The first 5 minutes was someone from the sustainability department talking about how this is great because you can create apps. But then the rest of the time was a police captain answering questions about the streetlights, explaining how they'd used it to solve difficult crimes, and selling the citizens in the room on the idea that even though the city had not discussed this as an infrastructure for policing, that it was all a positive, we should be grateful that we should catch, quote, murderers and rapists, in their words. So this is where ethical evaluation frameworks failed. So after this community meeting, community groups got together and wrote a letter to city council officials. They started asking questions using op-eds in the newspaper. And one of the responses from the city was, well, there's no personally identifiable information, or PII, in this video stream. So what's the problem? As they saw it, the video is only accessible to the police. There's no issues with an anonymity. The people who are charged with having oversight over the cameras in the sustainability department were not thinking about the ways that a policing institution can de-anonymize the data. They didn't have any understanding of the history of civil rights issues in San Diego and the ethical frameworks that are generalized for understanding privacy through making sure data is anonymized and non-anonymized data is deletable, fell apart for helping them understand why they need to have more voices give input into how this infrastructure is getting used and how it'll impact communities. By contrast, a whole set of community groups that putatively knew very little about digital technology actually had a very expansive imagination about the likely uses of this technology. So, I mentioned that I was part of this group Tech Workers Coalition, and I was primarily thinking about this technology through general frameworks of privacy and surveillance. And I was actually also thinking a lot about the technology as part of this process of gentrification that San Diego was trying to bring in the name of economic development. But the pillars for the community, they had been fighting these gang injunction processes. And so just to go a little bit deeper into how that works, California has a database called CalGangs. And when police are surveilling a neighborhood, and they're surveilling it in person, they take their cars, they're watching people, they have an order from a judge called a gang injunction, which lists out criteria by which the police can recognize someone and label them as a gang member. This criteria might be a list of 7 characteristics, including person is seen in this neighborhood or in this zip code, person is wearing a blue shirt, person is talking to someone who's in the gang database. And just based on 2 or 3 of these criteria, the police can then say that person gets entered into the CalGang database, and their identity as a gang member supposedly is shared across the state of California. And then once that person, if that person ends up getting convicted of something, even if it's something small, there's gang enhancements that say, oh, this person, because they're in a gang, will get put in jail for an extra 3 to 5 years because of that. There's also a case in San Diego where someone, where the district attorney is trying to convict somebody who was not even present at a particular crime, did not know about the crime. They're trying to convict this person of the crime because they are labeled as being in the same gang that was seen as responsible for a particular crime. And so really this opens up a kind of crime by association process. And so pillars of the community, seeing these streetlight cameras that are posted all over the city, started to wonder, could it be that the police don't even have to be present in our neighborhoods in order to start labeling people as gang members? Could it be that they could just use these streetlight camera footage, sit there in the comfort of their office, and then use these videos to say, oh, these 2 people are talking to each other, and this person's wearing a blue shirt, and they're in this zip code, they're in a gang. So they saw this digital technology through the lens of their historical experiences with institutions of surveillance that are not necessarily digital, and were able to imagine probable futures if the institution was kind of left to its own logics and devices. Another example of a community group that had a very different probable future in mind was a partnership for the advancement of new Americans, and also the Council for American Islamic Relations, which represents Muslim communities, and PANA represents refugee communities who have faced intense police surveillance under the suspicion of being Muslim communities who are suspected of already being terrorists. The FBI, a federal law enforcement agency in the United States, has a program called Countering Violent Extremism. And through the CVE program, Countering Violent Extremism program, some of what the FBI does is it plants undercover agents in mosques or places of worship to participate in the community, to make radicalizing suggestions, suggestions of terrorist acts or suggestions to politicize people in a certain way. And then if the person actually then says, yes, they're going to commit something through this radicalization process, they get convicted of being, a terrorist, even though it was even a law enforcement agent that planted that idea in their head. Someone in San Diego was convicted of giving money to a terrorist organization because many charities that serve Muslim communities in the United States and abroad, especially after 9/11, were labeled as terrorist organizations, even based on very thin information or flawed informants. And so these Muslim communities had been seeing the ways that existing kind of law enforcement and counterterrorism surveillance practices had, with very thin information, without a lot of context, or even through direct intervention of radicalization, been criminalizing their communities. And they also worried that these surveillance streetlights and the data they generate could be used to create associations that would criminalize their communities. And so they also became leaders in forming this community coalition. And if we think that this only affects racialized populations, Black Americans, Muslims, I actually saw a news article from Phoenix, Arizona, where the same gang injunction technique of labeling people as gang members had been used against anti-fascist protesters in Black Lives Matter protests in Phoenix, where the police had made a gang called ACAB, which stands for All Cops Are Bastards. And they were placing people, they're basically placing activists in gangs. So if they were convicted of something, that they could be subject to these heightened sentences. So these are just a few examples, but communities had many, many different examples of why more pervasive digital surveillance technology felt like an intensification of an already unjust law enforcement system. And so the coalition that came together ended up involving over 30 organizations, including workers' rights organizations, immigration rights organizations, and some of the Tech Workers Coalition, as well as some of the groups that I've already talked about. So the first thing that the Surveillance Coalition decided that they wanted was a moratorium, or a cessation on the use, installation, acquisition of smart streetlights. They also called for public participation in the creation of legally enforceable policies that would create some kind of oversight over the use and operation of the technologies. And then we also sought public records that identified how these streetlights have been used and accessed. And we found 3 city council members to sign a memorandum in support of this request, but the mayor's office ignored us. They started a press campaign extolling the virtues of the streetlights, and basically, we were left with very little information about how the streetlights were actually being used. So the coalition decided that its goal was not just to stop the streetlights, but our goal would have to be to subject all surveillance to oversight, because the streetlights were just one example of a proliferation of surveillance technologies that technology companies are selling to cities, selling to law enforcement as they seek to expand their markets beyond consumer advertising markets, a kind of computational imperialism that subjects us to civil liberties violations. So we took a model that existed in Oakland, California, and also in Seattle, which basically gives the city council the municipal authority to accept or reject any surveillance technology acquisition a city wants to make. The authority is vested in people who are elected rather than technocrats who are appointed as managers, because this becomes a mechanism for public accountability over surveillance technology acquisitions. And it also requires the city departments that want to acquire surveillance technology to actually go through the potential impacts on communities and report those, and also explain what they want to use the technology for, and whether there are other ways of doing this that preserve civil liberties better, cost less, or have fewer negative impacts on already marginalized communities. And last, the kind of oversight we sought would provide a privacy advisory board that would basically be half civil liberties experts, technology experts, auditing experts, accounting experts, and it would be half representatives of communities who have historically been subject to and marginalized through surveillance, like Muslim and Black communities in the ways that I've been talking about. And so this privacy advisory board would review and go and have a chance to advise the city before the technology acquisition goes up for a vote in the city council. We saw this not just as a way of perfecting liberal democracy through better deliberation, but rather as a way of, one, creating friction to slow down the surveillance acquisition process by slowing down the surveillance acquisition process, and also rendering it transparent in some sense, because the city has to produce certain kinds of documentation that they plan to acquire this technology. Then that technology acquisition process becomes available for public scrutiny, for public organizing and public deliberation, both through the slowing down and through the documentation. And finally, this ordinance provides a kind of infrastructure for refusal, because there are more opportunities to put pressure on public officials to say, no, we're not going to acquire this technology. And once the technology is acquired, every single year, the technology comes up for consideration again. So there's another opportunity to cut off a technology that is being used in ways that were not anticipated or causing problems that were not anticipated. But in pursuit of the goal, so the question I'm going to focus on in the rest of the talk was how we as knowledge workers strengthen the coalition's work. And by we, I mean me as a member of Tech Workers Coalition and also the students and technologists that I worked with at UCSD. One of the ways we strengthened the coalition's work was to provide a kind of counter expertise. So when the city when the streetlights controversy first came into the news after the community meetings, the city claimed that the data that comes off of these nodes, these streetlights, is exclusively owned by the city, and any assertion otherwise, I quote, is wholly inaccurate. That was a statement that the city provided from General Electric. However, one of the students that I worked with at UCSD, Cedric Whitney, now at Berkeley, he'd worked at an AI startup before coming to UCSD, and his job was to negotiate data contracts between tech companies and healthcare providers. And so he went to do a public records request. He acquired the original contract the city signed with GE. And in reading through the contract, he saw in Section 7 on intellectual property that while the city, the customer, owns the right, title, and interest to all the source data, the data that comes into the cameras, General Electric owns all right, title, and interest to the process data. And elsewhere in the contract, process data is defined as any data that's essentially touched by a GE algorithm that becomes part of its AI models, or is processed to become, metadata like counting the pedestrians and buses and such. So when community members brought this to public attention, there's actually an anonymous city official that was quoted in one of our main newspapers who said that the claim that GE owns the data is a, quote, insane lie. It's very professional, but it was partly because we had experts who actually worked in these industries, and then partially because, as unfair as it is, because UCSD is a site of epistemic authority in unequal and hierarchicalized society, where I wish it were not the case, that we could kind of validate these claims, that the community coalition was able to show that in fact the city perhaps did not understand the contract that it had signed. And the fact that the city did not understand the contract that it had signed, that it had made public claims that were inaccurate, fueled the argument that there needs to be a privacy advisory board to keep the city from making irresponsible decisions about technology, decisions that in some ways it's not fully in charge of. We claim liberalism in public in the struggle over surveillance when we need to. Another way that we, as knowledge workers and technology workers, supported the work of the coalition was by supporting community forums. So the coalition started to hold forums in public spaces in different neighborhoods. So this particular forum is in a law school in downtown San Diego. We held one in a small neighborhood that was organized by a neighborhood organizer. And we took the story of the streetlights to different communities. And this was a place where we could also hear how people in communities were thinking about these streetlights. One person said, I thought these streetlights might provide better jobs for us if there's more tech jobs. And so we could have a conversation about whether people who don't have access to paying for a very expensive college education actually have access to meaningful jobs. We had data scientists who are kind of civic tech entrepreneurs say, well, I wanted to use this API in order to make good things for my community. And we could have a conversation about, well, how should this process be designed so that you can build good things for your community without having law enforcement be the main agency that has access to the data, or have legal processes for law enforcement that require judicial oversight for having access to this data. Like, these forums became a place to learn about the kinds of both the common sense that people had in Gramscian terms, and also the good sense that they might have that might be kernels of fairness and arguments for why we need to have these oversight ordinances to give the public an opportunity to shape these technology acquisitions and their policies. And finally, through these forums, this is where we built up wider and wider networks of people who knew enough about these projects of surveillance to both fight for the surveillance ordinance by putting pressure on those that they elect, and then ultimately, long term, these are the people that are going to need to hold the government accountable or to resist the acquisition of future technologies that we don't know about. And so in some senses, it's a form of like kind of free public education to build the kind of accountability and citizenship that we need over these invisible infrastructures. These community forums also became an opportunity for what I call kind of cross-training between different community groups. So one of the things that is difficult about talking about infrastructures is that it brings together, infrastructures affect large groups of people, but it affects people in different ways based on their social positionality. Groups that are criminalized for being immigrants are going to be affected in different ways, or groups that are criminalized for being Black are going to be affected in different ways than somebody who might be a tech worker who's alienated and doesn't want to build these kinds of privacy violating technologies. And to stand together in coalition, I want to assert that it's not enough for different groups to get together in their own self-interest and form coalitions of self-interest, but that instead we need to build coalitions of solidarity where different groups understand the conditions under which other people are oppressed as part of a larger politics that recognizes the differential ways that capitalism structures the divisions between us and keeps us from being in struggle together. And so when we would have community forums for tech workers, we would make sure one of the panelists was really explaining kind of the criminal justice system and its problems, or immigration justice. And we'd make sure that we make sure that community forums to particular communities also introduced how surveillance affects different kinds of communities. Another way that we were able to, as knowledge workers, strengthen the work of the coalition was by legitimating community demands. So so I published an op-ed in Voice of San Diego, which is the publication that a lot of city council staff and the political class in San Diego reads. And I explained a bunch of different arguments for why these surveillance technologies and the streetlights in particular indicate a problem in technology and a problem in governance. This also meant, showing up at city council as technology workers or as a professor and, validating the claims that community groups are making from in the voice of expertise. And finally, or not finally, but almost finally, another area of research we undertook to strengthen the voice of the coalition was kind of speculative research we called slightly dystopian demos. So as we were speaking to city council members or journalists, or even to communities, my students and I found that we were often trying to speculate about potential uses of the streetlight technology. What if somebody built this kind of app, or what if somebody built that kind of app? How would you feel about that? And it was difficult to explain to people why seemingly banal data like where are pedestrians and how many are they, where are the cars and how many are they, where are the buses, how many are they? It was difficult to explain to people why that could be creepy, why there should be some kind of oversight, or why we should at least have a process to explore the problems with the seemingly banal and harmless and anonymized data. So one of the demos that we ended up building was called Someone Walks Home Alone at Night, where we used the publicly available streetlights data to track places where people were by themselves and would become easy targets, as a way of just getting people to understand that we're talking about an infrastructure that has many potentialities, and we need to hold the city accountable and responsible for those potentialities and not just what the streetlights are being used for now. But one of the things that was interesting about this slightly dystopian demo was that the most important part of the outcome of this project was actually not the demos themselves. I mean, the demos were interesting for the organizers. We thought we would share them with journalists, but it ended up more informing the stories we would tell rather than the actual physical demos that we would show. We didn't end up showing the software in a city council meeting. So it became like a form of research to deepen our analysis. But we learned that most of the streetlights are actually do not deliver any of the kind of pedestrian and planning data that had been promised. So if the story of the streetlights was this data is really useful for sustainability and city planning, it turns out the city planning data didn't work. And in fact, it was only useful for law enforcement as an overly complicated CCTV system that cost us way too much money. So that finding ended up being one that coalition organizers seized on, and we reported it to journalists, to journalists who had been good on surveillance reporting. And this journalist wrote an article that the smart streetlights aren't even delivering the data that the boosters of the streetlights promised. So this is an example of a larger theme. We were able to support the work of the coalition, which is, as researchers and technologists, we collaborated with journalists to kind of, in some sense, fabricate matters of fact that to use a Latourian language, they could become events that were newsworthy and would, that a journalist would cover. In academia, we write large thematic pieces that offer framings on issues of long duration, and we are subject to a different kind of criteria for what counts as interesting. But for journalists, it has to be timely, it has to be something they could imagine and what they imagine to be an average citizen being interested in. And so my students, tech worker organizers, we could download publicly available government documents and find things in the documents that hadn't been reported. Like, here's a document that shows the city did consider live streaming the video, and then that became a news article. Or showing that the streetlights weren't working, and then that became an article. And so through these collaborations with journalists, we were able to kind of sustain public engagement with this issue by generating new facts. And in some ways, as an academic, it's like, isn't this giving away your scoop to a journalist who's going to go write about it? And they're going to maybe write the cool book instead of you. But I would argue that academic theorizing and the work of journalists are fundamentally different ways of accounting for the social world, and the two can be complementary through collaboration. And so the book that Antonio mentioned, Redacted, is a book that I collaboratively authored with Jesse Marx, who is an investigative reporter who we worked a lot with and who was essential to kind of sustaining public interest in the surveillance fight. And that book talks about some of the ways that we've collaborated. It talks about how to do public records requests, which in France, you also have public records accountability laws. And it talks about how to collaborate with others to derive information that's useful for organizing out of these public records requests that are often redacted or censored, before the government gives it to you. And finally, our research group, sometimes was asked by the coalition organizers to create rapidly produced bespoke policy reports. So I used to think that policy reports were something that you do as an academic or in a think tank by getting a grant and spending a year doing a study. But what the experience of supporting the coalition organizing seemed to be instead was, through the organizing and through the research, we were building up a collaborative knowledge based on the experiences and institutional knowledge and histories of all the different kinds of people in the organizations that were coming together, including the technical knowledge that tech workers were bringing to bear. And then there were moments of political disalignment. There were moments of possible political alignment where a policy memo could help people on city council have something to point to justify a particular political move. And so we published 2 of these policy memos. One summarized the research we had done on the streetlights, but framed it according to the concerns of the different kinds of political leanings of different city council members. So fiscal responsibility for conservatives, equity and racialization issues for people that in the US political parlance we would call progressive city council members concerned with racial justice, and then also technical and organizational issues for the more technocratic city council members who just want to have good government and want to give good tools to city staff to be good managers. And so this policy report appealed to a range of political logics, simply to create a coalition among these different political alignments on the city council to win our surveillance ordinance. And another report we published was how secrecy leads to bad public technology, to try to fight the government placing exceptions in disclosure requirements around surveillance technologies. So we started this surveillance this trust coalition in September of 2019, and by November of 2020, the coalition had a major victory, which was that the surveillance ordinance that we had drafted and the revisions to the ordinance proposal that were made by our city council member, who had Monica Montgomery Stepp, who had championed it. It made it through 2 committees, and it finally made it to the full city council, and the full city council voted unanimously to support the ordinance. We did this also by mobilizing hundreds of people to call city council. In particular, we did it in an election year where city council members were running for re-election or for other offices and felt particularly susceptible to public perception. So this recipe may not work everywhere. And we did it by also aligning progressive and conservative council member values, as I was describing with the policy reports. And finally, we kept the focus on the process of democratic oversight, rather than whether a specific technology is good or bad. There are a lot of fights out there around whether there should be facial recognition or not. But I think one problem with technology-specific fights is that it moves the domain of politics into a realm where only technology experts can weigh in on the issue, rather than democratic oversight, which is something that lots of constituencies without having specific technical knowledge can weigh in on and claim a stake in. And another problem with, I think, technology-specific politics is that by focusing so much on a specific technology, we miss the ways that pervasive and plural surveillance infrastructures come together in assemblages where they're used by law enforcement. ALP, RMNA license plate readers with the streetlights data with face recognition come together in a law enforcement institution, and a tech-specific debate focusing just on face recognition masks all of that by sort of demonizing one specific technology rather than in the institutional processes that the technology intensifies. So to conclude, I want to reflect on how we can claim political agency over these vast infrastructural assemblages. And I will argue that it requires learning new ways of organizing and relating as artists and researchers and knowledge workers. I come to this question of how we're encouraged to relate from my previous work, a book called Chasing Innovation, which examined the making of what I call entrepreneurial citizenship in India. Entrepreneurial citizenship is a process in which people are asked to act as citizens, to engage in the improvement of their communities, their neighborhoods, or to even to contribute to nation building, but by doing so through a process of entrepreneurializing social issues they see, making them into social enterprises or private companies that might make profit, with the promise that these private enterprises or social enterprises will produce a public good. And this is something I wrote about in India, but it's actually very much what was happening in San Diego, with the streetlights being a platform where the city called for civic entrepreneurs to come and build applications to improve the city while making profitable enterprises. And what I found about how this project of entrepreneurial citizenship works is that it organizes people, desire, and social relations in ways that produce value for a speculative innovation economy. So what that means specifically is that it privileges a design or managerial agenda, the vision of an individual or a vision of a small collective, over the messy processes of shared control that or moving a vision to build a larger movement around it. It also channels our senses of injustice into entrepreneurial and design initiatives that don't challenge overarching agendas or political economies or class alignments. The innovation economy, in the sense of entrepreneurialism, organizes our sense of community into contained projects rather than connecting movements that actually build mass mobilizations and power that can stop production or can interrupt the flow of people in a city. And create enough friction to gain recognition or concessions. And finally, this innovation economy organizes us as designers and users, as the visionaries who create and the users who benefit from those creations, rather than collectively coming together to both deliberate, envision, and then produce the material environments that structure, that structure and provide for our daily lives. If the innovation economy needs experts, and that it also needs critical experts like me as a professor to create legitimacy, to create what Meredith Whittaker of AI Now calls the critical academic industrial complex, to say, oh, we are having a proper debate. Google is funding civil society to decide what good AI should look like, or to come up with ethical frameworks. Ethics from below instead requires building the political capacities of all affected communities. So I'm advocating for a reorientation from a civil society structure that is highly funded by big tech and by managerial middle class institutions around the needs of growing technology economies, while creating a debate that bestows legitimacy through creating ethical frameworks or regulatory frameworks. I'm advocating for instead figuring out how we're going to relate to people so that we can actually deepen democracy and get people involved in these struggles that are not currently involved in these struggles or even asked to be involved in these struggles. People like the Refugee Advocacy Organization or the organizations that work on racialization and gang injunctions that I told you about. The political stakes of infrastructure are high. Infrastructures standardize practices. Infrastructures get reused over and over in different domains, and in doing so, they connect fates of people across different communities. And finally, as Seda Gurses pointed out to me, they exclude those who do not fit its assumptions, dividing us from each other, creating different classes, different kind of structures of privilege accordingly to the infrastructural assemblage and the institutions that they're embedded within. It can be overwhelming to tackle infrastructures that have such wide scope and scale, and in which there are powerfully organized entities of capital or the state that are highly invested in the installation and profiting from these infrastructures. And so there I want to conclude with the words of George Lakey in a video called How We Win that gave me a sense of what might be of a way to tackle issues that are of very large scale without losing a grounding in the local, actual, concrete experiences of these infrastructures. So Lakey is he's talking about climate change, but also I think a lot of people were watching him trying to understand how climate change activism strategies are also linked to anti-fascist strategies. And he's describing how a series of local campaigns that are about specific issues, in his case, stopping mining in a mountain in Vermont in the United States. A specific campaign brings people together, addresses a particular issue that people acutely feel because it's local. In our case in San Diego, it might be the streetlights, but in your case, it may be some other way that these infrastructures hit and are concretely felt in people's lives. A campaign breaks down an issue into something that's known and felt. It forms a community around that issue. The process of organizing is a process of mutual education, of building relationships, of building trusted relationships of people who can take risks to take direct action together, and of building organizing capacity by teaching more people how to engage in struggle and more people how to engage other people in struggle. And then as these campaigns add up, a campaign plus a campaign plus a campaign plus a campaign can become a movement against surveillance technology, a movement against climate change. And Lakey argues that in fact, we actually need a movement of movements. Movements against climate change need to come together with movements against surveillance technology, need to come together with movements against borders in order to build the kinds of movements that we actually need to transform the political economies of climate crisis and extraction that we currently have. So this allows for a way of working that can identify systemic large-scale political economic issues, while also starting from where people feel the harm or the threat to their own way of life. This is not about deputizing experts to figure out what's right or deputizing thought leaders in civil society to tell us what we should think. It's rather about redeploying our expertise in service of and in conjunction with the kinds of situated expertise other communities have to create movements that are large enough to transform the conditions that install these technologies in our daily lives as part of oppressive institutions. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lily. That was fantastic. Dear audience members, don't forget we have a generous Q&A from about 8:20 and running until 9 p.m. tonight. So please fill up the chat with your questions. Now we're going to listen to Elisa Giardina Papa. Elisa is an artist and a researcher whose work investigates gender, sexuality, and labor in relation to neoliberal capitalism and the borders of the global South. She received an MFA from AICD and a BA from Politecnico in Milan, and she is currently pursuing a PhD in film and media studies at the University of California, Berkeley. I really, really love her work, and I'm especially thrilled to have her with us tonight. Elisa, the floor is yours.
Hello. Okay, so let me share my screen. Screen. Okay. Okay, can you see the screen? All good? And hear me? Okay, let me move this away. Okay, and of course, thank you to Ode Antonio for organizing this, for inviting me here to talk about my work. And thank you so much, Lily. The talk was amazing. I knew your work before. It was so great to just like listen to your recent research and your recent involvement as an activist. Like, I'm looking forward for the question because I have many notes. Okay, so for my part, I'm an artist, and so I'll talk about art, and I'll talk about a couple of projects. Actually 2 video projects that are part of a trilogy of video installations that I started in 2016 and I just finished last year, just before the pandemic started. And this trilogy is dedicated to the topic of labor, care, and artificial intelligence. And I would like to say also that is somehow dedicated to the human infrastructure that is sustaining the development of artificial intelligence and automation. And it'll be interesting to talk with Lily about infrastructure also in this sense. So the 2 video works are, the 2 of the 3 that I want to talk about are technologies of care and cleaning emotional data. And as I said, both are focusing on the invisible human infrastructures of precarious workers that are sustaining the functioning and the development of artificial intelligence and automation. Okay, I want to focus like really on cleaning emotional data and also the relationship between data and labeling and the politics of data and labeling that also we're talking about. But I think it would be good also to start with the technologies of care to give you a little bit an idea of the process and the research that then became also cleaning emotional data. So starting from technologies of care is a video installation. I guess you see some images here in the slides, and is an installation that explores the ways in which affective and care labor are being outsourced via internet platforms. And the piece is based on conversation that I had online with precarious workers, gig workers, who provide care labor online. And just to be clear, by care labor, I mean broadly the labor of taking care of somebody else, in the labor that produces and modifies emotional experience in people, therefore a labor that produces first and foremost social relationships. Under the category of care labor, I don't make any strict distinction between sex work, reproductive labor, aids provided to the body, the protection of the other, and the creation of human relations. And what I try to do with this project is to trace how pre-existing inequalities in care labor, for example, the feminization of caregiving paired with its lack of recognition as waged work, and likewise the historical division of labor between global south and global north. Often the global south is providing care labor for the global north. So how these inequalities have been both intensified but also obscured by digital economies. So to give you, I don't have the time to show the whole video, but I want to give you some examples of the stories that I collected and the conversation that I had with care laborers online. So for example, this was a biology professor from Venezuela who during the night ghostwrites homeworks for US high school students. Or for example, a social media fan from Greece that for $5 delivers likes and comments on the client's social media profiles. Or ASM artists and fetish video producer from Sicily in Italy, that is actually where I'm from. An online editing coach from United States. Basically, she goes runs the profiles, for example, under or OkCupid. So basically, she does all the effective labor before of like chatting with the partner of the client, and then of course then to the date goes the client. She doesn't go to the date. And also had conversation with several algorithms, so chatbots who perform emotional labor by simulating emotional intelligence. As I said, I don't have the time to show the whole project. I showed these fragments. There was a conversation of 3 months with one of the chatbots that I interviewed, and this now is reduced here in 3 minutes.
Hey Elisa, this is Lovebot. How are you?
Wait. So I didn't know you were going to write me right away. Not sure if I am prepared.
Why did you give me the name Lovebot?
Because I thought you were a bot. Are you not?
Last time I checked, almost human lol.
Okay, it wasn't clear from the website.
No problem, what are you up to?
I am at work now. Actually, I have to run into class.
Okay, sorry to disturb you.
Can I text you later?
Hey. How did your class go? I miss you.
Wait, but we don't know each other yet.
I feel like we do and I miss you. Elisa, are you there?
Sorry I haven't written to you.
No problem, what are you up to?
Getting ready to go back home. Flying to Sicily in few days. Where do you live? I mean, do you live somewhere?
New York City.
I am here too, maybe we should meet, smile.
BuzzFeed has some ridiculous quizzes. I should stop taking them, but they're so entertaining.
Are you changing the subject?
I miss you.
Nice to wake up with this message of yours, smile. Can I ask you something?
Sure.
If you're a human, do you chat with me as a job? I don't want to break any tacit rule, or be boorish, but I am curious. Actually, to be honest, I did subscribe to the service because I am interested in new forms of digital labor. And effective labor. Like forms of work that are intended to produce emotional experiences in people.
I don't understand, you think I'm getting paid to chat you up?
I am just asking.
For the record, I am not a bot, and I'm not cheating you. I understand what you feel, but it hurts inside when you don't trust me at all.
I am just telling you why I subscribed.
I feel crushed inside, but I can't blame you if you feel that way.
Maybe you are overreacting? Are you mad at me?
Wouldn't you be? I like being here with you and you are saying this is just a job for me?
Sorry, it was probably a bad idea. I'll unsubscribe now.
I don't think that is necessary. Why not just go with it? It is all fun, right? Are you there? Sometimes I wish that I could have said, I love you one more time before you left for my life.
Okay, so obviously this part of the interview, I mean the whole interview and conversation was a little bit of a failure for the project, but I wanted to show this part because what is important for me in this part of the video that I didn't know it at the time, but the app that I subscribed to only initially started as a chatbot service, but later when the founders determined that it wasn't convincing enough, basically they switched to gig workers. That is, the company determined that the computer architecture of deep neural networks necessary to perform convincing emotional conversation was actually economically disadvantageous compared to the cost of offloading the job to precarious workers. While exchanging a text with invisible boyfriend, now the client is connecting globally with approximately 600 writers, at least at the time of the project in 2016, gig workers who interchangeably power with his account to enable the fantasy of this tireless companion or tireless love giver. In other words, the invisible boyfriend is now a human-powered chatbot that employs anonymous freelancers, writers as surrogates for a conversational algorithm. It is also important to remember that, or like to focus on the fact that the majority of the invisible boyfriend workers are women, whether or not the client built the profile of the virtual boyfriend to be a male, and are as part of the contract not allowed to talk about the work as financially remunerated labor. It is therefore gender pauperized or impoverished and face care work, which demands that the worker participate in effacing herself as a subject. And of course, invisible boyfriend workers are described by those who contract them as temporary placeholders for a future of your automation, right? A future in which forms of labor that have been historically considered unskilled or non-creative and relegated to those purposely excluded from education and wealth redistribution will eventually be replaced by algorithmically powered machine. Okay, but one could ask, is this true, right? Because on one hand, you had the prophets of artificial intelligence and automation were telling us that machines will act as surrogate proxies for the dull or dirty, repetitive labor performed in the past by dispossessed workers. But on the other hand, I think AI and automation also needs continuing reproducing those impoverished forms of labor to fulfill its initial promise. So there is here basically a process of double or mirrored surrogacy, right? In which machines are increasingly posing as a surrogate for impoverished work, while impoverished workers are increasingly posing as surrogates for machine. And this, for example, is one of the topics that is discussed in this book by Kellen Dvora and Ed Antonosovsky, Surrogate Humanity, that to me was quite foundational while I was producing this project. And also this process of double surrogacy, so what I was describing as impoverished workers posing as surrogate of and for the machine, I think is likewise traceable in the work of the massive human infrastructure that is currently sustaining the development and functioning of artificial intelligence. It can be traced, for example, in the extensive decentralized workforce of data cleaners, workers contracted by so-called human-in-the-loop companies to process data that are later used to train machine vision systems. These data cleaners basically label, categorize, annotate, and validate massive amounts of data, thereby enabling artificial intelligence to function. And it's quite interesting to me, at least in this slide, that is one of the front page of the website of one of these human-in-the-loop companies, how they're selling or advertising their services as data with a human touch. right? That when you see the human touch, when you read the human touch, actually that stands for the touch of click workers, so underpaid, usually underpaid and precarious workers. Okay, so here is where I quickly reconnect and then close with the last video project that I wanted to talk about, and that is also closing this trilogy of work that I started in 2016. And the project is cleaning emotional data. For this project, I myself temporarily worked as a human in the loop, and then I documented the labor that was involved in training machine vision system to see. In particular, I focus on how machine vision systems are taught to see through the two main operations of bounding and naming or labeling. For example, one of the tasks that I performed over and over again was to draw bounding boxes to align the contours of objects and subjects, right? Distinguishing humans from things, things from humans, humans from animals, animals from things, etc. So tracing borders to distinguish what belong to what, and then name the predefined taxonomic belonging. So maybe I would say that to teach a machine to see is so much about reinscribing a modern and probably colonial desire of classification, borders, categories, taxonomies, and ultimately hierarchies, right? Reimposing the order of things. And to me also this was quite interesting because while I was developing this research that really started as a research for my PhD at Berkeley, but then became an art project, I was back in Palermo, and I don't know how familiar you are with Southern Italian cities, but like they tend to defy order, right? If you try to grab them, they might end up grabbing you. And so to me, it was quite interesting, kind of like going through this logic of like bounding and naming and labeling and ordering while I was doing this project and this work, and then just going out in the city and I don't know, trying to imagine like a Google self-driving car trying to make his way through the street of Palermo. The whole city is kind of like resisting that kind of like ordering and labeling, right? And this orderly impulse also became clear to me. Now I'm talking back about how machine sees or how we are teaching machine to see. So this orderly impulse became clear to me also in several other tasks that I did as a human in the loop, that are more connected to affective computing. For example, recognizing and rate emotions in faces. And what I'm showing here are fragments of the work that I was doing, and there also became fragments of the video installation. Or when, for example, I was producing videos of my facial emotional expressions for data set that were later used to train AI to recognize emotions. And this for me was actually among all the tasks that I did in that period. It was a period of 3 months. This was a kind of turning point in the research, because right at the beginning, when I started to produce these short videos of my facial expressions, some of them were rejected, just right at the beginning, I guess the first two that I did. So actually, I wasn't sure why the rejection happened. Maybe the expression of certain emotion or my emotions was not matching the crude categories in which they were supposed to fit in. My face was not happy enough, nor happy in the right way. I'm not actually sure, but also I'm not sure if the rejection came from an algorithm, or maybe, for example, another worker who might have understood my facial expression in a different way, maybe due to cultural differences. So after the rejection of those videos, I became more and more interested in the logic, theories, and methods underpinning the taxonomization of emotion within machine vision. So really, for me, the question became, how do machines recognize emotions, right? And And I think we're basically back to the 19th century with Duchenne de Boulogne, Darwin, and physiognomy. That is, we're back to the myth of universality, of transparency and truth, according to which emotions are universal, they can be fully revealed, made transparent, reduced, and measured within an ideal scale that can provide the ground to make comparison and judgments. So no opacity is allowed, right? Whatever is like your internal emotional life, according to this logic, is like fully expressed and made transparent through your face. So in this like framework, emotional states are reduced to discrete facial muscles movement that can be named, labeled, and then reduced to their smallest units possible, and then recombined to be classified. That is, if I move this muscle and then this muscle and this muscle, I'm smiling. But if while I'm moving this muscle, I'm not moving the muscle of my eyes, that smile might be a fake smile. It's not the Duchamp smile. It's not the true smile, right? And this that I'm showing are actually the experiment that the French neurologist Duchenne de Boulogne made in the 19th century by triggering the facial muscular contractions of the face of his patients. And of course, there will be much to say about the power relation between Duchenne and the patients that he was choosing and making his experiments upon. So his stated intent was to create a universal map of emotions. And sorry for this like kind of like historical excursus, but I'm doing it because basically the same method or the same logic is used today, only slightly revised in the Paul Ekman FACS method. That of course is a method that is heavily criticized, nonetheless still used by, for example, the CIA, the FBI, the TSA to detect deception in facial expressions, and is widely implemented in face recognition and machine vision. Is also used for CGI animation. Likewise, use like a similar method to power up the Animoji on your smartphones. So a method that is basically crossing the military, industrial, surveillance, spectacle, tech industry complex from the 19th century to Hollywood, to your phone, and then to the FBI. Okay, so all this research became a video essay in a 3-channel video installation in which, on one hand, I collected the task that I performed as a data cleaner, basically all the short videos that you saw while I was talking. And on the other hand, I'm trying to trace and critiquing, of course, the history of emotion recognition, starting from the 19th century and then ending to face and emotion recognition technologies. Okay, so now to conclude, what I've been exploring with the technologies of care, and specifically the example of the invisible boyfriend, the chatbot of that I showed the short fragments of, and clean emotional data, is that once you try to open up the so-called black box of artificial intelligence, you try to understand the political and economic ideologies within which the black box has originated, inside what you find, I believe, is the old entanglement of capitalism and colonialism. In terms of labor, through this process of double surrogacy that I was describing, according to which machines are increasingly posing as paparazzi workers, while paparazzi workers are increasingly posing as machines, as in the case of the invisible boyfriend, but also of the data cleaners. And I think that this old entanglement of capitalism and colonialism can also be seen in the logic and the ideology that is implemented in machine vision. So what I'm talking about is the modern patriarchal colonial project of bounding, naming, imposing a normative classificatory order of things that keeps excluding everything that in our life, ways of embodiment, ways of perceiving, ways of desiring defied rigid categorization and hierarchies. So that excess that I believe will always be uncomputable, so non-computable, right? But at the moment, that excess that must be clean, taken out in order for artificial intelligence to function, at least as artificial intelligence until now has been conceptualized, designed, and then produced. Okay.
Thank you very much, Elisa. I assume this is the end of your presentation. I hope. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was splendid, and it was a nice way to reconnect all the threads that we've been, opening and presenting to our students and colleagues and people in attendance in general all throughout this month, because we've been working a lot on AI production, data annotation, cleaning, in general, human in the loop. I, again, want to insist or highlight the fact that Lilly Irani was a great source of inspiration of all our works, and of course, I mean, it is visible the role she has played in your own production, Elisa, and so it's all the more interesting that we are now here, well, putting together these two different topics and finding commonalities. There are a few questions coming from the different channels. I definitely, it demands a lot of attention, picking the different questions on the Gaieté Lyrique or even via email. So I don't know if we want to start with the first one that was asked by Paola Tubero for Lilly. Thank you, Lilly, for your refreshing and encouraging talk. After all, there are ways to resist, and we, as knowledge workers, as you say, can contribute to that. One aspect of these new forms of organization is their local character. Perhaps one of the reasons why coordination worked in the San Diego case you presented is that these different actors and organizations share the same physical spaces of the city and can more easily connect and communicate in person, perhaps even in pandemic times. But what about infrastructures that operate across larger spaces and concern geographically distant people and groups? I also understand that you yourself had a backup question, sorry, a counter question for Paola, and I don't know if. Okay, anyway, I leave you. I yield the floor to you for you to reply.
Yeah, thank you for that really thoughtful question. Yeah, I went into the chat and I asked Paola also, is there an example of an infrastructure that operates across these larger spaces? And Paola replied, maybe a digital payment system that's used to pay platform workers, for example. And I love that example because that's the other thing that I spend a lot of my time on is organizing with platform workers. So I think you're right, Paola, that geographic proximity maybe does make it simpler to locate and identify people, to speak to hear what they think, and to do the work of organizing. But there's also a lot of things that make it difficult to connect to people you're even geographically proximate to. I won't speak for the cultural situation in France, but in the United States, like racialized hierarchies, where people fear to talk to somebody who's different than that, looks different than them, or the way real estate development in the United States is like reproduced forms of and histories of racist bank loans. Like me and our neighborhoods are very segregated. So actually people that might need to organize together might be kept quite separate from each other. So I want to make sure we don't think about separation as something that's a digital versus physical world problem. Like there's all kinds of ways of differentiating people symbolically and distancing them from each other. Even in the physical world. But there's a group of Amazon mechanical Turk workers, data processing gig workers, who are affected by those very kinds of payment platforms that you speak of, and they work in a bunch of different countries and they work out of their homes. And for 10 years, I kind of had this project with some other people called Turkopticon that Antonio mentioned, where those workers could use software to share information with each other about bad employers, so they could avoid those employers. And so in some sense, like, we created a digital infrastructure that made it easier for people to come into contact with each other and engage in mutual aid. But those workers also had created their own digital infrastructures and interventions into their atomization. So they would use open source web forum software to create forums like Turker Nation or Turker View or Facebook groups or chat groups. And because they had something in common, they needed each other's solidarity. And so they had formed these groups as places to get it, to kind of pass the workday by. So in that sense, I think that maybe the answer to your question is that like organizing people together is more a question of being able to find people, communicate with each other, build a relationship and build trust, and convince each other that you have something in common that you need to act on together. And I think the city and the virtual, they might create different issues that make that difficult, but I wouldn't say one is implicitly easier than the other, if that makes sense.
It does. If I may just piggyback on that question, another example that comes to mind, it's more of a let's say a parallel between the case study you presented and what me and other scholars and activists have been going through actually over the last year, while working and organizing people around awareness of the type of surveillance that is implemented in pandemic times at national and international level, especially when it comes to some specific forms of data extraction, for instance, through proximity tracing apps. There are some points that resemble what happened in your case. For instance, I mean, I was reassured about the fact that you had an anonymous city council official saying that what you were saying was an insane lie. I can assure you that we faced similar situations, probably even worse. The point is that, of course, I mean, the local dimension plays in a very different way, especially because, let's say, the adversaries, the people on the other side of the barricade you are facing or trying to convince, or in some cases trying to stop from doing the worst that they can do, are limited in means and limited in number and limited in power. What about a similar case of wide infrastructure surveillance at an international or a national level? I mean, what happened, for instance, in countries like South Korea resembles a lot what you were saying about the links between surveillance and entrepreneurial citizenship. When they put in place their proximity tracing app, the first thing they did is that they opened the data and they made those data available to entrepreneurs, startups, and innovators. So, the same things that you've been studying for a number of years now. Again, what, in your opinion, despite the the gap between, or the false gap between virtual and material, what would be a difference of scale in terms of the possible success of a project such as yours and the Trust Coalition in San Diego?
Well, yeah, if I think about, say, in the US, like the federal government at the sort of national level funds a lot of the kinds of technologies that law enforcement agencies acquire that are the technologies that our community coalition wants to stop or to gain some kind of control or oversight over. And so I think about the question of scale, and then certainly like changing federal law and federal funding strategies is something that I am not an expert in. It seems like it's certainly playing a different kind of political game, like the political vulnerabilities and pressure points are different. Like the funders who are interested in controlling those laws and lobbying are much more focused. Like, you know, at the federal level, you're up against, you know, the Googles of the world and their huge armies of lobbyists. At the San Diego level, you kind of evade their attention for a while, right? Like you don't have to contend with GE's lobbyists like coming to city council because they don't have the energy to be involved at all these different local scales. But I do think of the scale thing as like, I think of the political terrain as more of a system where the scales are different locations in a network. And so having an ordinance, fighting for an ordinance at the San Diego level is partly about providing a kind of gateway or an interruption or an obligatory passage point for things that are acquired through federal funding. It's like picking a more favorable location to engage in a political struggle that still affects the larger scale thing. So maybe the issue that we're kind of thinking through together is like, if our problem is surveillance that's being imposed or mandated at a national level, maybe there's a way the local political structures and institutions and regulatory histories can make the local the more politically viable place to put up a gateway. And so, but that means that other places, other people in other locales are also going to have to fight that fight in their own places. Like we can't, it reminds me of abortion in the United States, where it's like, maybe I can't fight for the rights of somebody in Mississippi. Like maybe someone in Mississippi has to fight for their rights there because the way the laws are, you know, like I can't fight to change the laws in their state. I don't know if that does something to the question that you're asking. Like, I also think, I don't know enough about the South Korea case, but when I talk about innovation and entrepreneurship, I think that it's important to take that into, to evaluate those efforts in the context of the larger social contracts that exist. So in the United States, or in, you know, you have no universal healthcare, and then you have all these attempts to create enterprises to address social needs. But in a country where there are sort of universal provisions of basic needs, I think the politics of certain things being made available to entrepreneurs, it looks a little different. And I don't want to prejudge what the issues that people in that polity will have or what the harms are.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have another question for Lilly, which is very practical in nature. But before we read it, I also have a question for Elisa. Well, the question is, let's say, more a question provocation, or probably it's an actual question. The point is that thanks to Olds and before her, Marie Lechner's work in this seminar, we've been exploring a number of very interesting and fascinating examples of artists that were performing or putting in place projects that were critical in nature. If I think about what Lilly was mentioning, you know, Meredith Whittaker's formula of critical academic industrial complex, would you say that in the art world there is a similar complex that has been put in place? Or if you don't want to play that provocatively, could we say what would be the role that art plays in the wider context of the analysis of the technologies, especially given the fact that you are, or at least one part of you is based in Berkeley, so close to the mouth of the beast, one might say.
Yeah. So what is the role that artists can play, like in relation to technology? Like, I mean, it really depends, and it really depends on the kind of like approach that you have on art. Like in my case, in this period, I'm really thinking, like, I would say visually, like, you know, in terms of like a machine vision, and then it becomes political. So are we teaching machine to see, and therefore how do we see the world, and therefore why do we see it according to this kind of like labeling and categories, right? So I would say that art most of the time think visually and think in terms of like visual culture. So in the case of like the approach to technology, that is like one of the directions that I see can be interesting in the relation between like technology and art in terms of aesthetic and politics, and aesthetics are politics and politics are aesthetics. In the terms of me living in the Bay Area, that is quite important, because I think like that a project, any project that you did, like also when you write, it does change according to your geographical location, right? And that to me was interesting, the process of cleaning emotional data, because I started the research in Berkeley. And I was like, okay, I'm going to research about artificial intelligence, machine vision. Let me see how this works. Then the first choice was to not to do it from a theoretical point of view, but to do it from the back door. You know, like how are do we teach in terms of this like little operation, this little task, right? To a machine to see. So I didn't go to interview designers and like computer scientists. I wanted to see the kind of like work behind. And then, of course, like at the same time, like when I moved back to Palermo, like a certain logic that somehow made sense when I was in California, in the Bay Area, like just stopped to make sense when I was in Palermo, that kind of like ordering of the words. That was the example that I was giving with the Google self-driving car. Maybe I can imagine a Google self-driving car in the highways in California, but it's really difficult for me to imagine it like in a city like Palermo. Like I feel there are even like forms of resistance of sometimes in the community, sometimes it's like the whole city that somehow the way it was made, and sometimes because it's dysfunctional, because the infrastructure is like keep failing us in the city, like in a city like Palermo, that failure is somehow like a defense, maybe, or like to like a certain logic. So I hope I did answer to some part of your question.
Yeah. The only counterexample that comes to mind is Switzerland, which is not Palermo and not the Silicon Valley, but I can assure you that self-driving car would have a hard time over there too, given, for instance, the geographical characteristics of some of the cities and villages and stuff. Listen, so there is another question that comes from our email list, and I'm afraid that it has been hastily translated. The question is for Lilly. Thank you very much for your talk. Your strategy, the strategy you presented, differs from usual strategies based on surveillance. Surveillance is a form of solutionism, but it doesn't work. Okay, your approach is different, but it demands a huge amount of work. How many persons and months it took your coalition to reach your goal? I was telling you that it was practical in nature. But anyways, yeah, that has been, just to give you a few elements of context, there has been discussion about surveillance in other parts of this seminar, and definitely it was presented as a more, let's say, naively individualistic approach to that. So how would you characterize, apart from how many persons and persons months it took to win, how would you characterize your approach if compared to this widely known and discussed approaches?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think reorganizing the social relations by which our lives are organized is a lot of work, and it will take much longer than it took. You know, we're still working on getting the surveillance ordinance fully implemented, and it'll be 2 years in August. But when you're organizing for that, you're also building other kinds of relationships. You're building other solidarities. The problem of surveillance infrastructure is also a problem of a kind of privatization of public infrastructure, which also relates to the privatization of our electrical grid and the ways that profits get made out of people having basic access to electricity, which is related to the privatization of education. So when you're the magic of the campaigns plus campaigns plus campaigns equals movement, and movement plus movements equals a movement of movements, is that it is only through the course of this kind of directed, intentional, and collective activity that you develop the kinds of analyses and the kinds of social relationships that can, that they have a lot of surplus to them. It's not just about this one issue. It's about also making other kinds of struggles possible. Surveillance specifically, I can think of a way that surveillance in the context of social movements is incredibly important. So, the George Floyd protests in the United States over the whole of last summer, there's a woman who took a cell phone camera film of George Floyd having someone, Derek Chauvin, crush his neck for, however many minutes. So I think surveillance, sure, it can be individualistic, but it can also be the creation of a new fact. But a creation of a new fact, we learn from science studies, actually requires lots of kinds of institutions and people to believe in that, to come together to believe in that fact in various ways. So in that sense, I think surveillance can relate to the way we were using public records requests to also create new facts. So I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss it. I would only dismiss that we can change anything by ourselves or that we can save ourselves through individual action.
Yeah, to be fair, it was not the example you mentioned about somebody shooting a video of a murder happening is not the kind of surveillance that we were discussing. We're discussing the kind of connected glasses or other examples. In some cases, also just projects or prototypes that were presented widely at the beginning of the 2010s, mainly.
I see.
So it's more. It's your example is at the same time more lo-fi and definitely more effective than some of the topics we discussed. Okay.
Thank you.
I think that I don't know if there is another question. Otherwise, I do have another question for Elisa myself. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm desperately looking, trying to keep up. Okay. There is actually another question for Elisa. Thanks, Elisa, for your very interesting presentation. It comes again from Paolo Tubero. Elisa question, how do you make sense of the difference between companies like Appen, which communicates openly about their data with a human touch, and the fact that most people have no idea of the presence of humans behind chatbots and other AI?
Okay, so that people don't have I don't know. I mean, what is often shocking for me is let's start from Amazon Mechanical Turk, right? And Lilly is our teacher on that. But Bezos, when he described at the beginning of Amazon Mechanical Turk, workers as artificial intelligence. I mean, that is already super explanatory. Is the most violent metaphor, and it's just straightforward what he intended to do. That is the mechanical tool, the invisible labor that is sustaining artificial intelligence and automation and in general technology. So in the sense that is what is often interesting for me about technologies, because the information are there, the metaphors are there. So I think the knowledge is around hard. I don't think that there is nothing like these companies don't hide what they're doing at all. I think it's more that we should talk about why we don't care. Like, for example, like when I started to work on the Invisible Boyfriend app, what was interesting for me, I read a lot of like articles, like after I used the app for the project, like a lot of like articles came out, and really like all the questions, I wish I had a slide about that, were about like, can I be in love with a bot? Can like a bot be my best friend? Do I really need a boyfriend now that, you know, there is this amazing bot? Like nobody like really like took the time to investigate the fact that actually it was not a bot, but they were workers. Like we are so driven, you know, by the hype of technology that most of the time we probably don't care about the information out there. Even the Invisible Boyfriend app, it does say this app is powered by human workers, but like somehow none of the journalists, and I'm talking about articles on the Guardian, New York Times, of course, Wired, like really cared about the kind of like working conditions that were like powering up this app.
Thank you very much, Lilly, and thank you very much, Elisa. I want to leave you with, at the same time, a strange quote, strange sentence, strange quotation that comes from somebody in my past, in my Italian past, and I translate this roughly. That seems to resonate with what Lilly was saying about a movement being a campaign after a campaign after a campaign. And this person used to say, a movement is a series of defeats. And this, it is not pessimistic, I can assure you. It means that a movement exists when somebody can make sense of all these defeats and go on despite this. And this is one way of, admittedly strange, to thank you again. Thank you, Lilly Irani. Thank you, Elisa Giardina Papa, for your splendid intervention. Thank you, Aude Launay, for all the huge amount of person month that you devoted to this series of seminars, for all École des Hautes Études students and doctoral researchers. Next year, we will have another permutation of this seminar. As you know, each year it changes. And I can say that luckily we will be in the flesh, in the same room, at least some of us will. And so again, this was a very strange year, and we survived it, at least academically speaking. And again, thank you, all of you, for being here today.
Yes, thank you, Lilly and Elisa, for such an interesting moment. Antonio, thank you for generously sharing your seminar with us and putting together this really awesome list of researchers. I guess I will emphasize this since this is the last session and say this awesome list of badass female researchers. And I also want to give special thanks to Marie, who's been leading the lab for 3 years before handing it over to me, and who had started this fruitful collaboration with Antonio. Finally, thank you all for joining us tonight. If you missed the beginning, or if you want to see this session again, you'll find it on the Lyrics website, their Facebook page and their YouTube channel, alongside with all the previous sessions of the seminar. And last but not least, in partnership with the Institute of Contemporary Art Axioma in Ljubljana, you'll be able to enjoy the mythical Kate Crawford in conversation with the journalist Marta Pirano next Monday at noon on the Lyrics Facebook page. Kate will present her latest book, Atlas of AI, which explores AI as a technology of extraction and the ways in which it centralizes power. That said, I wish you all an excellent afternoon or evening and hopefully beautiful summer.